Chapter 5 of our book discusses some of the transversal key issues and objectives of the foreign policy of the European Union. First of all, the promotion of human rights, democracy and rule of law, which for the EU is not only extremely important as foreign policy objectives, but it's also an inherent part of its identity as an international actor. Secondly, we focus on conflict prevention, crisis management and peace building. Thirdly, non-proliferation of weapons and control of arms exports. And finally, the fight against terrorism. In this short video, we will not discuss each of these key priorities separately. Rather, we will focus on some general findings.
A first finding is related to the multifaceted, multi-method and multi-level nature of EU foreign policy, which we also discuss in chapter 1 of the book. For each of these key issues, the EU developed a comprehensive policy using a broad range of instruments from the various facets of EU foreign policy. Diplomatic activities and political dialogue within the framework of the CFSP, CSDP missions and operations, different types of international agreements including various kinds of partnership, association and cooperation agreements, development cooperation, financial assistance, sanctions and also the external dimension of many internal policies. This also implies that both the intergovernmental method and the community method are used to take and to implement decisions and to employ this wide range of policy instruments.
Besides the multifaceted and multi-method nature of EU foreign policy, these key issues also reflect its multi-level character. And indeed, EU policies on these key issues are always complemented by national foreign policies of member states, and they are embedded in broader international frameworks. And to obtain some consistency in its foreign policy across different facets, different methods and different levels, the EU has adopted several comprehensive strategies and action plans. And examples of such attempts to streamline the EU's activities on key issues are, for example, the so-called strategies, action plans and guidelines on human rights and democracy, or the EU strategy against the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction.
A second finding is that there are major variations in the extent to which these key issues are prioritized. Let us have a look at human rights and the rule of law and democracy. This is considered as being very important by the EU, but there is a great variation in the extent to which a third country's respect of human rights, rule of law and democracy is a defining factor for the EU's relations with that countries. For example, failures to respect human rights and democracy in countries such as Belarus or Cuba or Myanmar have resulted in sanctions by the EU. But problems with human rights and democracy in, for instance, Saudi Arabia or other oil-exporting Gulf states have not been fundamental obstacles for the EU's relations with those countries.
And this is also related to the varying prioritization of these key issues in comparison to other policy areas and objectives, such as trade interest, control of migration or supply of energy. And balancing these various policy objectives is not at all an easy task, because they are all important for the member states of the EU and for the EU itself. But it's clear that in some cases the EU quite easily accepted to set aside human rights and democracy objectives. And a recent example is how the EU tried to compensate the loss of energy supply from Russia by strengthening relations with Azerbaijan, Algeria and other countries, despite their quite problematic human rights records.
From that perspective, it is not surprising that the EU is often criticized for using double standards in its foreign policy. This is not only the case for the EU's human rights and democracy promotion policies, but also for the other key policies. For instance, whereas non-proliferation of nuclear weapons is an official priority of the EU, and the EU wants to avoid that third countries obtain nuclear weapons, one of the EU member states, France, is one of the world's main nuclear powers. Or while countering the spread of small arms may be important for the EU, several EU member states belong to the top 10 of weapon exporting countries. Or while the EU may argue that conflict prevention and peace building are amongst its priorities, seen from a non-European perspective, the military interventions of several EU member states in Libya, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Sahel region rather contributed to lasting crisis and instability than to preventing it. Overall, these double standards in EU foreign policy also explain why major questions are often raised about the effectiveness and the legitimacy of EU foreign policy.